So you want to run ancient Egypt. First requirement, you need to personally own every drop of the Nile floodwater, because in this economy, there's no separation between owning the land and owning the god who controls whether that land floods on schedule. Miss one flood season, and it's not a bad fiscal quarter, it's a famine, a peasant revolt, and possibly the collapse of your entire dynasty. Getting into the pharaoh business wasn't a matter of capital, it was a matter of blood and priesthood. The throne passed through a royal lineage tightly managed by the priesthood of Amun at Karnak, and by the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, the temple complex at Karnak alone controlled an estimated 1/3 of all cultivable land in Egypt, worked by a workforce historian's estimate at over 80,000 people. You didn't apply for this job. You were born, adopted, or married into it, and if none of those worked, you married your own sister to keep the bloodline pure enough to qualify. Which, fun fact, is part of why genetic analysis of royal mummies shows startling rates of inherited conditions among later 18th dynasty rulers. If bloodline wasn't available, there was a faster path. Military coup dressed up as divine selection. Horemheb, a general with no royal blood, seized the throne around 1319 BCE, after the death of the boy king Tutankhamun and the brief, chaotic reign of the elderly vizier I, and simply had temple scribes retroactively erase the previous heretic pharaohs, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and I, from official king lists. Horemheb ruled for roughly 14 years and functionally rebooted the dynasty's legitimacy through what modern historians now call one of the earliest documented cases of political rebranding, through erasing the paper trail. Compare that to how power transferred in Egypt's regional rival, Mesopotamia, where city-states like Babylon changed hands through negotiated tribute and shifting alliances between multiple competing kings. Egypt ran the opposite model, total centralization under one god-king, with zero legitimate competing power centers, at least on paper. That centralization is precisely why Egyptian administrative records survive in such staggering volume. The state literally tracked grain deliveries down to individual sacks, a level of bureaucratic obsession that modern accountants would recognize immediately. Here's a stat that surprises people. Contrary to Hollywood's obsession with slave-built pyramids, archaeological excavations at Giza since the 1990s, led by Egyptologist Mark Lehner, uncovered a purpose-built workers' village housing an estimated 10,000 laborers who were paid in bread, beer, and meat rations, not enslaved. Skeletal analysis shows evidence of healed bone fractures treated with actual medical care, and worker graffiti found near the pyramids includes team names like Friends of Khufu, suggesting organized labor gangs with genuine pride in the project, not chained captives. None of this worked without a safety net for when the flood failed. The state maintained massive centralized granaries, essentially Egypt's version of a sovereign wealth reserve, storing surplus grain during good Nile floods to distribute during low-flood famine years. It covered basic subsistence for the general population during agricultural shortfalls. It did not cover political stability. When the Nile floods failed repeatedly during the first intermediate period, around 2081 to 2055 BCE, the granary system couldn't compensate fast enough, and centralized pharaonic authority genuinely collapsed into roughly a century of regional warlordism. So why would anyone want to run this thing beyond raw divine ego? Here's the real mechanism. Ancient Egypt functioned as a resource extraction monarchy, where the pharaoh technically owned all land as a legal fiction, then redistributed usage rights to temples, nobles, and officials in exchange for loyalty, labor quotas, and a fixed percentage of harvest yield, typically estimated between 10 and 20%, depending on the region and period. This wasn't taxation in the modern sense. It was rent, collected from tenants who happened to be the entire population of a country, on land the state claimed to own by divine right. Picture it small. A mid-tier local official, managing roughly 500 acres of Nile floodplain, might collect grain rents from tenant farmers worth, in modern equivalent terms, several hundred deben of copper, ancient Egypt's rough unit of value, per harvest season. Subtract the mandatory portion owed upward to the regional temple or royal granary, maybe 30% of collections, and that official nets a comfortable surplus, indefinitely, as long as the flood cooperates and the farmers don't starve to death mid-season, which would be, obviously, bad for repeat business. Now scale that up. At the height of the New Kingdom under Ramesses II, around 1279 to 1213 BCE, Egypt controlled agricultural output from the entire Nile Valley, plus tribute from conquered territories in Nubia and parts of the Levant, and the combined royal and temple granary system is estimated by economic historians to have controlled grain reserves equivalent to feeding a population of roughly 3 to 5 million people for extended periods. That's not a kingdom. That's a centrally planned agricultural monopoly with a state religion attached as the enforcement mechanism. There's a second revenue stream just as important as grain rents: gold. Egypt controlled gold mining operations in Nubia and the Eastern Desert so extensively that neighboring kings openly complained about it in diplomatic letters. In the Amarna letters, a cache of 14th century BCE diplomatic correspondence, the king of Mitanni literally writes to Pharaoh Akhenaten saying, roughly translated, "Gold is like dust in your country, begging for more of it." Modern estimates suggest Egyptian mines under the New Kingdom produced several tons of gold annually at peak output, funding both temple construction and, more practically, foreign policy, through what historians now recognize as some of the earliest large-scale international bribery ever documented. Speaking of things that quietly accumulate without anyone noticing, if you've ever wondered how your personal data ends up scattered across dozens of broker websites without your consent, that's basically the modern version of an unmonitored Nile tributary, and Incogni exists to dam it up, automatically contacting data brokers and forcing them to delete your information before it gets resold. The link in the description gets you 55% off an annual plan. Back to Egyptian gold, because that flow of wealth is exactly what funded the third major economic engine: monumental construction as a form of forced savings and political messaging. Essentially the ancient equivalent of infrastructure spending that also doubled as propaganda nobody could ignore for 4,500 years. Since, well, it's still standing. Now the scandal. Around 1155 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses III, tomb worker records from Deir el-Medina, the village housing royal necropolis laborers, document what's now recognized as history's first confirmed labor strike. Workers hadn't been paid their grain rations, on time, for weeks. Administrative corruption in the granary distribution chain, essentially officials skimming rations meant for royal tomb builders, left workers hungry while building the tomb of the god king himself. The workers didn't riot. They simply sat down outside the mortuary temples and refused to work until paid. A documented, peaceful labor stoppage recorded on papyrus by the scribe Amenekteh. Nobody involved in the ration skimming was executed. The strike eventually got partial payment, and the underlying corruption in the granary bureaucracy was never fully resolved. Ironic, given the empire builders they were actively working for. Then came the real collapse, and it took roughly 2 decades to fully unfold. Starting around 1213 BCE, following the death of Ramesses II, Egypt entered a period of severe Nile flood failures, documented through sediment analysis and grain price records, compounded by what modern climatologists studying the broader Late Bronze Age collapse now believe was a multi-decade regional drought affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean. By the reign of Ramesses III, around 1155 BCE, tomb records show grain prices spiking to roughly 8 times normal levels during shortage years. Simultaneously, groups modern historians call the Sea Peoples launched coordinated invasions along Egypt's delta coastline, and while Ramesses III's forces repelled the initial assault, the economic strain of fighting a war during a famine drained royal granary reserves to critical levels. Within roughly 80 years of his death, the centralized New Kingdom administration functionally dissolved into the fractured, weaker Third Intermediate Period, with regional high priests at Thebes effectively ruling as independent kings while nominally acknowledging a much weaker pharaoh up north. Pull the lessons out of that collapse. First, an economy built entirely on one predictable natural event, the annual Nile flood, has zero redundancy when that event stops being predictable, no matter how large your grain reserves look on paper. Second, corruption in the distribution chain, not corruption in the collection chain, is often what actually breaks a resource extraction system, because workers building your monuments and fighting your wars notice missing rations faster than any auditor does. Third, military victory doesn't save you from economic collapse if the war itself drains the reserves you needed to survive the underlying crisis that started it. Here's the insider stat that reframes the whole civilization. Modern isotopic analysis of royal mummies and tomb worker skeletons suggests famine-related malnutrition markers spike dramatically in the exact same generations as major granary corruption is documented at Deir el-Medina, meaning the natural disaster narrative historians told for over a century undersells how much of Egypt's periodic collapses were administrative failures wearing a drought's clothing. Zoom out and the structural truth is this. Ancient Egypt functioned as history's longest-running resource extraction monarchy, one where legitimacy was maintained exactly as long as the Nile flooded predictably, and the granary bureaucracy actually distributed what it collected, and every major collapse in 3,000 years of Egyptian history, without exception, traces back to one or both of those systems failing simultaneously. So what did actually running a piece of ancient Egypt's economy look like in real numbers? Small scale. A local temple estate managing a few hundred acres might collect grain rents worth several hundred deben of copper equivalent per season, with maybe 30% owed upward to regional authority, netting a comfortable multi-generational local elite lifestyle, no army required, just a functioning flood. Large scale. An imperial-level operation like the Amun priesthood at Karnak, controlling roughly a third of national farmland plus gold mining operations and international tribute. Generating wealth modern economic historians estimate in the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars annually at peak New Kingdom output. Against the ongoing cost of temple staff, labor gangs, and military garrisons, netting an institution so wealthy it eventually rivaled, and briefly outright replaced, the Pharaoh's own political authority. So yes, you could run ancient Egypt. Just remember, the Nile is the entire business model. The granary is your balance sheet. And the moment the flood stops showing up on schedule, it doesn't matter how many gods you claim to be. You're just the last name carved on a monument nobody's paying to maintain.